He's gone! My boy is gone! The scream tore through the silence of the woods, startling birds from the trees and sending shivers down the spine of anyone who heard it. Sheriff Dale Whitmore, standing on the porch of the small farmhouse just beyond the tree line, felt his stomach sink. He turned toward the sound, gripping the brim of his hat as he spotted a mother, Rachel Sims, sprinting across the grass with a look of panic only a parent could understand. It had started as a quiet Saturday. The sun peeked through the clouds over Pine Hollow, a rural stretch of land tucked in northern Georgia. Just 78 people lived within 10 square miles of each other. Folks here knew each other by name, face, and favorite pie. Rachel Sims, 34, schoolteacher, single mom, had lived in the white farmhouse with green shutters for 5 years now. Her son, Daniel, was 6 years old, full of questions and even more energy. They had a golden retriever named Buck, who shadowed the boy everywhere. That morning, Rachel had been cleaning the kitchen when she noticed Daniel and Buck playing out back. She had the window open to let in the fresh air and could hear the boy laughing as he ran into the woods, calling out for Buck to chase him. She wasn't worried at first. The woods backed right up to their property, and Daniel knew better than to wander too far. "Just to the fence and back, sweetheart," she had called out, drying her hands on a towel. "Okay, Mom," Daniel yelled. An hour passed, then 2. By the time she walked out to check, the yard was empty. No Buck, no Daniel. Now she was running barefoot, her voice breaking as she scanned the trees. "Daniel, Buck!" Sheriff Whitmore met her halfway, his hand firm but gentle on her shoulder. "Rachel, when did you last see him?" "He was playing out here. He went into the woods with Buck. He's never gone this long." Whitmore didn't wait. He turned to his deputy, Levi, who was already climbing out of the cruiser. "Call it in. Get search and rescue. We've got a missing child." Word spread fast in Pine Hollow. Within an hour, nearly 30 neighbors had gathered. Men in boots and plaid shirts, women holding flashlights and extra jackets. Everyone loved Daniel, and everyone adored Buck, the shaggy dog who'd once rescued a kitten from under the school building. Rachel stood near the tree line, hugging herself. Her sister, Marlene, who had rushed over from town, stood beside her. "He's smart, Rach. He probably just got turned around. Buck'll bring him home." Rachel nodded, eyes scanning the forest like a hawk. "He better." The search began at dusk. Volunteers fanned out, calling Daniel's name and whistling for Buck. The woods were thick, green, and tangled. The ground was soft from the recent rain, making every step slower. At one point, they found small footprints near the creek. Levi squatted to look at them. "Size 6, little tread pattern. Could be his." "No dog prints with him?" Whitmore asked. "None that I can see." That sent a chill through the group. Rachel refused to leave. She sat on the porch, staring out into the darkening trees, her fingers clutching Daniel's worn-out sneakers. Buck had never left Daniel's side. If something had happened to her boy, where was Buck? It wasn't until well after midnight that the first sound came. Snapping twigs, the crunch of movement through brush. Every flashlight turned in the direction of the noise. Someone whispered, "Did you hear that?" Suddenly, out from the trees, covered in mud and leaves, came Buck. He was limping, his fur matted, panting hard. But it wasn't the sight of Buck that made Rachel drop the shoes and run. It was what Buck carried in his mouth, a red Superman sock, Daniel's favorite. The crowd went still. Buck staggered forward, gently dropped the sock at Rachel's feet, then barked once, loud and clear. He turned, limped back toward the trees, looked over his shoulder. "He wants us to follow him," Levi said. "Let's go," Rachel said, already running. The trail was rough. Buck led them down ravines and over moss-covered rocks. Twice he stopped and waited for Rachel to catch up, then trotted forward again. The sock had a tear in it and a small smear of dirt, but no blood. That gave Rachel a thin strand of hope to cling to. Finally, nearly 2 miles from the farmhouse, Buck stopped at the base of a large cedar tree. He barked again. Sheriff Whitmore stepped ahead with his flashlight and swept the beam across the base of the trunk. There, under a patch of brambles, was a shape. Daniel. He was curled up, his cheeks smudged with dirt, and his eyes fluttered at the light. "Mom?" Rachel fell to her knees, scooping him into her arms. "Oh, my baby, I'm here. He was shivering, but unharmed. "Buck stayed with me," he said, voice tiny. "He barked at the scary sounds. He kept me warm." The entire group exhaled as one. Sheriff Whitmore looked at the dog, now lying on his side, tail wagging slowly. "We'll carry the boy back," he said. "Someone carry the dog, too." Marlene scooped up Buck gently, whispering thanks in his floppy ear. Back at the house, paramedics checked Daniel over. A little dehydration, a few scratches, but otherwise perfectly fine. Buck, on the other hand, had a sprained leg and needed rest. Rachel sat with Daniel curled in her lap, Buck sprawled beside them. The entire town had gathered around, cheering quietly. Rachel looked up at Whitmore. "I don't know what we would have done without Buck." "He's not just a pet," the sheriff said. "He's family." The days that followed brought waves of support. Neighbors brought food, cards, and dog treats. The local vet treated Buck for free, and the town paper ran a front-page story with the headline, "Loyal Retriever Leads Family to Missing Boy." Daniel told anyone who asked that Buck was his superhero. He even gave him his favorite red cape to wear. Buck wore it proudly, limping around the house like he knew he'd done something important. But something lingered in the back of Rachel's mind. Daniel had said something about scary sounds in the woods. He couldn't describe them exactly, just said they sounded like a growl and something crashing. The search party hadn't seen any signs of wildlife, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that Buck had faced something dangerous out there. She watched him one night, sleeping near the back door, ears twitching at every noise. She knelt beside him, scratching the soft fur behind his ears. "You protected him, didn't you? You stayed with him when he was scared. You're his hero, Buck." His tail thumped the floor. Whatever had happened out there in the woods, Buck had kept it at bay. He'd stayed by Daniel's side until help came. And when it didn't come fast enough, he'd gone to get it. Rachel pressed her cheek to the dog's head. "Thank you." Outside, the woods swayed gently in the wind. Life in Pine Hollow returned to normal. But for the Sims family, everything had changed. Because sometimes, the bravest heroes walk on 4 legs, with muddy paws, shaggy fur, and a heart big enough to save a life. Buck's limp hadn't quite gone away, even after 2 weeks of rest. The vet, an older man named Dr. Carter, who ran the only clinic in a 40-mile radius, had said it might take longer for a dog Buck's size and age. "He's pushing 10, he'd told Rachel with a sympathetic pat on her shoulder. "But he's got heart. That'll carry him farther than most." Rachel wasn't concerned about the limp. What kept her up at night was the way Buck had started watching the woods. Every evening around dusk, the old retriever would plant himself at the sliding glass door, ears forward, tail still. He wouldn't bark, wouldn't whine. He'd just stare, alert and quiet, like he was waiting for something. Daniel didn't notice. He was too busy building Lego towers and retelling the story of how Buck had saved him to anyone who would listen. He had told the tale at least 15 times to the mailman alone. Rachel didn't have the heart to stop him. Let him feel proud. Let him process it. But when Daniel wasn't around, Rachel would kneel beside Buck and gently ask, "What do you see out there?" He never responded with more than a flick of his ears. But he never left that door until the sun was gone and the sky had turned fully black. By the third week, Sheriff Whitmore stopped by the house with a couple maps and a thermos of black coffee. He laid everything out on the kitchen table, smoothing the edges with his thick fingers. "Been thinking about what Daniel said. The growls, the crashing. Still bugs me." Rachel poured him a second cup and sat down, her hands wrapped around her mug. "You think it was a bear?" "Could be. Or a bobcat, though they don't usually come this far down. No prints, no fur caught on branches. Nothing turned up when we looked." She glanced toward the back door where Buck now lay, tail twitching. "Maybe Buck chased it off." "Maybe," Whitmore said. "Still, I want to walk the area again. Not just the tree line. I want to go deeper. Something spooked that boy." Rachel hesitated, then nodded. "I'll come." "Rach, I need to see. I've been picturing that tree where you found him. I need to see it again." Whitmore didn't argue. They planned the walk for Saturday. That morning, Rachel left Daniel with Marlene, packed 2 bottles of water, granola bars, and a flashlight into her backpack. Buck watched her, alert the moment he saw her lace up hiking boots. When she slung the bag over her shoulder, he rose, hobbling on 3 legs. "You're not coming, buddy," she said gently. Buck whined. "He really wants to go," Whitmore said, stepping inside. "He's still healing." Buck barked softly, then sat by the door. Rachel looked down at him. "If I say no, you'll just sulk, won't you?" Buck wagged his tail once. Whitmore shrugged. "Might be good to have him along, if there's anything he remembers." 10 minutes later, Buck was in the back of Whitmore's truck, and they were heading down the narrow dirt road that looped through Pine Hollow. The air was crisp, the leaves just starting to change. It had rained the night before, so the scent of earth hung thick in the air. They parked near the clearing and walked the trail, retracing the steps from that night. Buck led, limping slower than usual, but never stopping. His nose skimmed the ground, his ears forward. Rachel stayed close to him, one hand on her backpack, the other occasionally brushing the thick fur on Buck's back. They reached the cedar tree within 30 minutes. "Here," Rachel said. "He was right here." The spot looked different in daylight, less frightening, more familiar. Still, she felt a lump form in her throat as she imagined her boy curled up beneath those brambles, alone. Whitmore knelt to the ground. "No signs of animal activity. You'd think if something big was stalking around, there'd be claw marks or broken branches." Rachel scanned the area. Maybe Buck chased it off before it got too close. Just then, Buck barked once. Not loud, not scared, just focused. He stood near a patch of trees about 20 yards from the cedar, his head low, his body still. Then he sniffed the ground and barked again. Rachel walked over slowly. "What is it, boy?" Buck pawed at the earth. Whitmore joined them, pulling out a pocket knife and gently scraping back the top layer of leaves and soil. He froze. "What is it?" He brushed more aside, revealing a circular indent in the soil. "That's not natural. That's a footprint." Rachel leaned closer. It was broad and wide, at least twice the size of her own foot. "Bear?" she asked. "Maybe, but it's wrong. Look here." He pointed to a deeper mark near the edge. "That's a toe, I think, but it doesn't curve right." Buck sniffed the print, then sneezed and stepped back. Whitmore stood slowly. "We need to call the wildlife folks. This could be something we don't usually see out here." Back at the farmhouse, Daniel ran into Buck's fur the moment they returned. "You went to the woods without me?" "Only for a little bit," Rachel said, ruffling his hair. "I want to go next time." "No way, wild man. Not until we figure out what else lives out there." Later that night, after Daniel had gone to bed, Rachel stepped onto the porch with Buck beside her. The stars were bright, the moon high. In the distance, the woods stretched dark and silent. "I thought we'd moved past this," she whispered. "I thought it was over." Buck leaned against her leg. Rachel turned to go inside, but a noise stopped her. A low, distant rustling. Then a short, sharp bark. Not from Buck. From the woods. Buck growled. A deep, low sound she hadn't heard from him in years. The next morning she called Whitmore. He came with a trail cam and a motion sensor. "We'll set it up at the cedar. See what we get." They mounted the camera high on the trunk, angling it toward the clearing. The motion sensor blinked red once, then settled into standby. That night, Rachel barely slept. Buck paced by the door until 2 a.m., then finally lay down with a huff. The next day, they retrieved the camera. Rachel clicked through the photos on her laptop. Deer, squirrels, more deer, a raccoon. Then, wait. She stopped on an image taken just before dawn. A blurry shape, large, upright, vague outline, too far for detail, but too big to be a deer. "That's not normal," Whitmore said. "I'm not crazy, right?" Rachel asked. "That's not a bear." He stared at the screen. "We need better cameras." They ordered 2 more, mounted them around the clearing. Rachel didn't tell Daniel, no need to scare him, but she kept Buck close, even let him sleep beside her bed at night. If something was out there, he'd hear it before she did. A week passed. Nothing out of the ordinary. The motion sensors caught the usual nighttime visitors. Foxes, owls, once a raccoon fight that knocked the camera sideways. Then, on a Thursday morning, the main camera caught something else. Rachel nearly dropped her coffee mug. The image was clearer this time. A tall shape, partially hidden by a tree. Broad shoulders. No fur. Skin. Clothes. It was hard to tell. But it wasn't a bear, and it wasn't a person from town. She knew every man in Pine Hollow, and none of them stood that tall. She called Whitmore. He stared at the screen. "We need to figure out what this is." Rachel pointed to the timestamp. "That's the same hour Daniel was taken." Buck, lying at her feet, growled softly. They printed the image, showed it to Dr. Carter, the vet. He squinted at it, then frowned. "You didn't hear this from me, but we had a few calls over the years from folks deeper in the valley. Said they'd seen something like that. Always at night. Never stuck around long." "You think it's some kind of animal?" Dr. Carter shrugged. "Might be. Might be something else." Back at home, Rachel tucked the photo into a drawer. She didn't want Daniel to see it. Not yet. But Buck... Buck stared at that drawer for nearly an hour that evening. That weekend, Daniel had a bad dream. Screamed in his sleep. Rachel ran in, found him tangled in the blankets, crying. "It was in the trees," he sobbed. "The thing that growled." "What thing?" "I don't know," he said, trembling. "But Buck chased it away." She held him close. "You're safe now?" but she didn't feel safe. Not really. She looked out the window. Buck was standing on the porch again, watching the trees. Always watching. The air felt different that morning. Thicker, like something unseen hung in it. Rachel stood at the sink, pouring cereal for Daniel while glancing toward the tree line every few seconds. She tried to act normal, humming some old tune from the radio, but her eyes betrayed her. Buck was already outside, stationed in his usual post beside the porch railing, staring into the woods with the same unwavering intensity he'd shown for weeks now. Daniel swung his feet from the kitchen chair, spoon clinking in his bowl. "Do you think the growly thing lives in a cave?" Rachel froze, cereal box halfway back to the shelf. "Why would you say that, honey?" He shrugged. "Buck growled at the trees last night, and the moon was really big. I think monsters like caves. They're cold and dark, right?" Rachel gave a small smile. "There's no monsters. Just trees and shadows, that's all." "But shadows hide things," Daniel replied thoughtfully. She couldn't argue that. That afternoon, Whitmore called. "I've got a buddy with the Forestry Service. Says there's been some odd reports from hikers about 10 miles out. Animal noises, tree damage, even a couple folks who left in a rush." "Do they match anything we've seen?" Rachel asked. "Could be coincidence, but he's sending me the report. He wants to come out here and see the cams for himself." When Steve Thomas from the U.S. Forestry Service arrived the next day, he looked more like someone heading out for a fishing trip than an official visit. Ball cap, windbreaker, a dusty old backpack slung over one shoulder. He shook Rachel's hand firmly, then knelt and gave Buck a good scratch behind the ears. "Looks like this guy's been through it," he said with a low whistle. "He's our hero," Rachel said. "He brought Daniel back." Steve examined the trail cam photos without comment for nearly 10 minutes, flipping between shots. Finally, he leaned back in the kitchen chair and exhaled. "Well, I don't think you're crazy, but I also don't know what we're looking at." "Not a bear?" Whitmore asked. Steve shook his head. "Shape's wrong. Bears don't have shoulders like that, and they don't walk that upright unless they're stretching or scratching. This thing looks like it's walking, moving with purpose." Rachel felt a chill creep into her spine. Steve continued, "We've had stories over the years, not in any official paperwork, of course, but off the record, hikers talk, hunters whisper. Some say there's a creature, big, tall, smells bad, and leaves strange tracks. Always at night. Sounds like something from a campfire tale," Whitmore muttered. "Sure does," Steve replied. "But enough people mention the same details over the decades, you start wondering." Rachel folded her arms. "What do we do?" "We go take a look," Steve said. "I want to check that clearing and the trail leading in. If there's something dangerous living out there, even just an aggressive bear, it needs to be documented." Rachel nodded. "I'm coming." "Absolutely not," Steve said. She looked at him. "You said aggressive animal, maybe a creature. That's my backyard. That's where my kid got lost. I'm coming." Buck barked once, as if to second that. And so they set out. Steve, Whitmore, Rachel, and Buck. Daniel stayed with Marlene again, happy enough to draw pictures of Buck with a red cape and eat homemade cookies. The hike to the cedar tree was quiet. Too quiet. Even the birds had gone still. Steve paused every few feet to examine broken branches, overturned stones, odd patches in the grass. He took soil samples near the footprint, snapped dozens of photos, and marked tree bark that showed unfamiliar gouges. Then Buck stopped. Completely. His ears pointed forward, body rigid. A low growl rumbled from deep in his chest. Rachel followed his gaze. Something moved deeper in the brush. A flicker. A shape too large for a deer, too fast for a bear. Steve reached slowly into his pack and pulled out a small recording device. Pressed record. "Don't move," he whispered. Whatever it was, it didn't come closer. It stayed just out of view. After several tense minutes, it vanished. Steve didn't say anything until they got back to the house. Once seated at the kitchen table again, he finally broke the silence. "I don't know what that was, but it knew we were there, and it watched us." Rachel's hands trembled slightly as she poured a second cup of coffee. "Is it dangerous? If it wanted to harm us, it had a dozen chances. But that doesn't mean it's safe. It's a wild thing, whatever it is." That night, Rachel dreamed of trees that whispered and branches that grabbed. She woke drenched in sweat, heart racing. Buck lay at the foot of the bed, eyes open, body stiff. He heard it too. She moved to the window. Out by the edge of the woods, a shadow stood, motionless, watching. Then it stepped back and melted into the trees. In the morning, Rachel and Whitmore reviewed the newest cam footage. A blurry shot caught at 3:12 a.m. revealed something tall, mid-step, striding past the clearing with long legs and oddly jointed arms. "I'm not putting Daniel on the bus again," Rachel said. "He's staying here. I don't care if it means homeschool." "Agreed," Whitmore said. "You're not overreacting. Whatever that is, it's too close for comfort." Steve came back the following day with a colleague, an ecologist named Grant. Thin, quiet, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He spent an hour just scanning tree bark. "Found a hair sample," he said finally, holding up a small plastic bag. Inside, a single strand, coarse, almost translucent. Not fur, not quite human hair either. Rachel stared at it. "You ever seen anything like that?" "Not in this region. Maybe not anywhere." That evening, Grant and Steve set up sound recorders throughout the woods. They would run all night, triggered by movement and noise. Rachel barely slept. Daniel tossed and turned in his bed across the hall, muttering in his sleep. At one point, he called out for Buck. The dog raced in before Rachel could even rise. "Stay," she whispered to Buck, who stood protectively by Daniel's bed the rest of the night. The recordings the next morning were chilling. Low rumbles, throaty breathing, and something else, an eerie, almost human-like hum. Not words, but not random noise either. Intentional. Rhythmic. Grant looked disturbed. "This isn't a bear or a wolf. It's vocalizing, intelligently." Rachel leaned over the speaker. Her heart pounded. "It's talking." Steve nodded slowly. "In a way, we may be dealing with something different." The team agreed to move cameras closer, despite the risk. Buck went with them. He was slower now, but every bit as determined. And when they reached the second grove, a place they hadn't explored before, he stopped dead in his tracks. Rachel noticed the stillness, the unnatural silence. Even the wind held its breath. The grove was circular, trees bent inward as though pulled by invisible strings. In the center, a mound of rocks arranged in a careful, deliberate spiral. Bones scattered nearby, small animals mostly. Grant photographed everything. Steve took samples. Whitmore stood close to Rachel, hand on his holster. Buck sniffed the spiral and whimpered. "We need to go," Rachel said, voice low. "I agree," Grant whispered. "This wasn't made by accident." That night, the humming came again. Only this time, it was closer. Rachel sat in Daniel's room, reading while he slept. Buck lay across the doorway like a furry blockade. Then the humming rose, a vibrating sound, just outside the house, deep, beckoning. Rachel crept to the window and peeked through the curtain. The shadow stood in the yard. For a second it looked directly at her. Then it turned and faded into the darkness. Buck didn't bark. He only growled low and long. And Rachel knew, whatever this thing was, it wasn't done yet. The morning after the shadow appeared in the yard, Rachel didn't let Daniel out of her sight. He stayed home from school again, this time without argument. Buck stuck close, his tail down but his eyes sharp. Rachel brewed a pot of coffee strong enough to keep a trucker awake for a week, and sat at the kitchen table with the phone in one hand, flipping between tabs on her laptop. Whitmore showed up mid-morning, hat in hand, face worn. Steve and Grant are out checking the grove again. They'll be back before dark. Rachel didn't say anything right away. Her eyes were on Buck, who had taken up a position under the window, watching the yard like a sentry. He saw it too, didn't he? She finally asked. Whitmore nodded. I think he hears it better than we do. She rubbed her temples. It looked at me, not like an animal, like it was deciding something. Whitmore sat down across from her. You think it wanted to scare you? Rachel shook her head slowly. No. I think it wanted me to know it could come closer if it wanted. That it chose not to. The words sat heavy between them. Whitmore reached over and laid out a small map, one of several the forestry team had been compiling. It showed their house, the cedar tree, the new grove, and a dozen markers for camera positions and found tracks. Everything's circling your property, he said quietly. Not the town, not the roads, just here. Rachel stared at the map. The dots weren't random. They formed a loose ring, always outside the fence line, never crossing into the immediate yard. It's watching us, studying us. Whitmore looked uneasy. Which is what smart predators do before they act. She stood and paced to the window. Buck didn't move from his post. Beyond the trees, a squirrel darted along the branches, the only sign of motion. Everything else was still. That afternoon, Steve returned with Grant, both men dusty and tight-lipped. Steve held a small container out to Rachel. Another sample, he said. Scrap of something caught on bark. Feels like skin, but it's not. It's like thick silk. Smells earthy, almost mossy. Rachel didn't want to touch it. What kind of creature has skin like silk? Grant cleared his throat. There are theories, evolutionary anomalies, creatures that adapted in isolation, or something older, prehistoric, reclusive. We don't know. Rachel wasn't sure which option disturbed her more. That night, the humming started again. But this time it was accompanied by a sound that made Rachel's blood freeze. A knock. A soft, deliberate knock on the back door. 3 knocks. Then silence. Buck stood, every hair raised. Rachel didn't move. She reached slowly for the flashlight, but before she could flick it on, Buck snarled. The first time she'd heard him make a sound like that since he was young. She crept to the kitchen and flipped on the porch light. Nothing was there. The trail cams recorded no movement, but in the morning, Steve found something near the fence line. A mark. Deep, long, and etched into the wooden post. Not clawed. Carved. An eye. Or at least a shape that resembled one. With 4 lashes extending like rays. Beneath it, 3 small dots. Rachel stared at it. That was meant to be seen. Steve nodded. It left a message. The next few days passed without sightings, but unease settled over the property like fog. Rachel and Daniel spent their time indoors. Buck patrolled the windows. Whitmore stopped by every evening, armed and alert. The other neighbors didn't come near anymore. Pine Hollow, once a close-knit little town, had gone quiet. Then Daniel did something unexpected. He drew the mark. Rachel found it on a scrap of paper left on the kitchen counter. The same shape carved into the post. The eye, the rays, the 3 dots. "Where did you see this?" she asked gently, kneeling beside him. "In my dream," he said. "It talked to me, said it was watching to see if we were kind." Rachel's throat tightened. "Did it hurt you?" Daniel shook his head. "No. It said Buck is good, that Buck is brave." Rachel swallowed hard. "What else did it say?" Daniel paused, brow furrowed. "It said it's waiting. For something." Rachel folded the paper and tucked it into her jacket. Then she hugged Daniel and held him there longer than usual. She showed the drawing to Steve and Whitmore. Neither man said much, but Whitmore finally muttered, "How does a 6-year-old draw something he's never seen?" Rachel had no answer. That night, a storm rolled in. Thunder cracked, rain poured in sheets, the windows rattled. Rachel sat awake, flashlight beside her, Buck curled at her feet. Daniel had fallen asleep in her bed, comforted by Buck's presence. Around 2:15 a.m., the power went out. The house went black. Rachel lit a candle. The wind howled. Buck's ears twitched. Then, deep in the woods, a sound, clear even through the storm. A howl, long, haunting. Not canine, not wolf, not anything she'd heard before. Buck stood up. "Don't," Rachel said, standing. "Don't go out there." But Buck didn't move toward the door. He looked at her, then at Daniel, and lay down again. Rachel kept the candle burning until morning. In the morning light, everything looked normal, but the air smelled different, damp and sharp, like wet stone and moss. The trail cams were dead, not just batteries. The memory cards were gone, the cases smashed. Steve stared at the remains. Something knew what they were, and wanted them gone. Grant added quietly, "It's smarter than we thought." Back at the house, Daniel asked if Buck could wear his cape again. "It keeps him brave," he said. Rachel helped tie it around Buck's neck. The old dog wore it like armor, tail wagging just once. That afternoon, Rachel wrote a letter. Not to anyone in particular, just a record, a log of what had happened. Then she packed a small bag, slung her flashlight over one shoulder, and whistled for Buck. "I need to see the grove again," she told Whitmore over the phone, "and I'm not waiting." He met her at the edge of the woods. "You're sure? I need to understand what it wants. I think it's waiting for something. I don't want to wait to find out what." Buck led the way. The grove looked different, not untouched, but rearranged. The stone spiral had been cleared away. In its place was a circle of bones, neatly stacked, animal remains that had been bleached clean. In the center lay a single feather, long, gray, with a shimmer like smoke. Rachel bent to pick it up, but Buck barked sharply. "Leave it," Whitmore said. "It left that for a reason." As they turned to go, Rachel stopped. Carved into the trunk of a nearby tree was a new shape. A dog. 4 legs, a tail, and beside it, The same 3 dots. Buck sniffed it, then wagged his tail once. Rachel didn't speak. She just looked at the mark, then at Buck, then at the woods. Something was changing, and it wasn't finished. The sound of Rachel's boots against the forest floor was muffled by the wet leaves, soft and slick after the recent storm. Buck moved beside her with slow, limping strides, his cape dragging just slightly in the mud. Whitmore trailed a few steps behind, keeping an eye on their surroundings, hand resting near his sidearm, though he hadn't drawn it once in weeks. Rachel didn't blame him. It was becoming clear that a weapon wouldn't be much use if whatever lurked out here decided to come closer. The tree with the carved dog and 3 dots stood quiet and still. Rachel stared at it, unsure whether to feel honored or afraid. Buck sniffed the base again, then sat. His tongue lolled out, and he looked satisfied, as if the trip had confirmed something. Whitmore approached, glancing at the drawing. So now it's not just leaving marks, it's talking to us. Rachel nodded. And Buck's the one it's talking about. They didn't linger. Something in the air still felt off, not hostile, but watchful. Rachel felt it most when she turned her back to the woods, a pressure between her shoulder blades, as if a gaze was pressing there. Not visible, not threatening, just present. Back at the farmhouse, Daniel had fallen asleep on the couch, arms around one of Buck's old plush toys. Rachel sat beside him and gently brushed his bangs from his forehead. His face was peaceful, his breath steady. He hadn't had a nightmare in 2 nights. A small victory. Marlene was sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of peppermint tea. She looked up as Rachel stepped in. "You look like you've seen ghosts." "Not ghosts," Rachel said, pulling out a chair. "Just signs." "Anything new?" Rachel told her about the feather, the new carving, the way Buck had reacted. Marlene listened without interrupting, her fingers idly tapping the side of her mug. "I used to think people who talked about strange things in the woods were just trying to scare kids," Marlene said after a while. "Now I think they just didn't know how to explain it either." That night, Rachel left the back door unlocked. Not open, just unlocked. She sat on the porch with Buck lying at her feet, his cape now slightly faded from sun and dirt. The stars were out again, and the air carried a soft breeze that rustled the trees like whispers. "Are you still watching us?" Rachel murmured into the dark. "Are you waiting for something from me?" Buck lifted his head. His ears twitched. Then he stood and moved to the edge of the porch. Rachel stood too. "What is it, boy?" Buck looked up at her, then back to the woods. Then he stepped down, paws light on the ground. Rachel followed without hesitation. She didn't bring a flashlight. The moon was bright enough, and somehow she knew the path would be clear. They walked in silence, past the barn, past the fence, into the woods. Buck led steadily, no limping, no hesitation, as if something had changed in him. He stopped at the grove. The circle was untouched, the bones still stacked, the feather still lying in the center. Rachel stepped forward and knelt beside it. She didn't reach for the feather this time. She spoke softly. "What do you want from us?" There was no voice, but she felt a shift, like pressure against the air. Buck sat beside her, ears alert, but calm. Rachel looked up and saw movement. From between 2 trees, a shape emerged. Tall, silent. It did not step forward, only revealed itself enough to be seen. A silhouette darker than the night, but not unnatural. Its outline shimmered slightly, as though heat rose from its surface. It didn't growl. It didn't speak. It watched. Rachel's voice was calm. "You were there when Daniel was lost. You didn't hurt him." No response. But the pressure shifted again, like a nod in the air. "You left a mark of Buck." "Why?" The shape tilted slightly, then slowly one arm lifted, not with speed or threat, but with grace. A long finger pointed toward Buck. Buck stood, chest puffed slightly. He walked to the feather in the center and lay down beside it. Rachel didn't understand, not completely, but something deep in her chest stirred. A feeling of recognition, not of the creature, of the moment. This was a ritual, not for harm, for acknowledgement. Buck had been tested and found worthy. The shape lowered its hand, then took a step back. The shimmer faded, the outline melted into the trees. It was gone. Rachel stood, her breath catching in her throat. She looked down at Buck, who looked up at her, panting lightly. She whispered, "You passed, didn't you?" Buck wagged his tail. They returned to the house just as dawn broke. Rachel didn't say anything. She fed Buck, sat beside Daniel until he woke, and kissed his forehead. Later that day, Steve and Grant arrived, surprised to find Rachel calm and at peace. "I saw it," she told them. "Last night." Steve's mouth opened slightly. "And?" "It's not here to attack, not like we thought. I think it's watching the same way we do when we find something strange. It doesn't understand us yet. But Buck, he made contact." Grant looked skeptical. "What do you mean?" "It chose him. Or he chose it. I don't know which." The rest of the day passed quietly. No new sightings, no new sounds. But at sunset, Buck returned to the grove. Rachel followed again. And this time, something had changed. The bones were gone. The feather, too. In their place, a small totem, made of twigs and moss, shaped like a dog. It stood on all fours. No dots this time, just the form. Simple. Pure. Buck sniffed it, then nudged it gently with his nose. Rachel didn't touch it. She didn't need to. Something was building. Not aggression. A bridge. She looked into the trees and whispered, "We're listening." And somewhere, in the space between heartbeats and shadows, she felt the woods whisper back. The totem stayed where it had been placed for 3 full days. Rachel didn't disturb it, and neither did Buck. Every morning after breakfast, Daniel would pat Buck on the head, then sit by the window to draw pictures of him with a stick figure next to him. Tall, shadowy, sometimes with dots above it, sometimes without. Rachel didn't ask what the dots meant. She had her suspicions. Steve and Grant came back the following afternoon, this time with a new motion camera, one that uploaded footage to the cloud in real time. They'd brought a small solar panel for it and set it up just outside the grove. They said very little while they worked, but both men moved with an energy that suggested they knew they were watching something historic take shape. Rachel and Buck stood a few paces back, observing. Buck's tail wagged softly the whole time, his eyes never leaving the circle where the totem stood. Grant finally broke the silence. "What do you think it means? The totem?" Rachel tilted her head. "I think it's a symbol of recognition. Not from an animal. From a being something that understands meaning. Steve squinted up at the trees. I've been doing this for 23 years, hiked all over the state. I've never seen anything like this. There are rules out here, and this thing, whatever it is, it's not breaking them. It's writing new ones. That evening, Rachel invited them both to stay for dinner. They sat at the long kitchen table, passing dishes back and forth, the smell of roast chicken and rosemary bread filling the room. Daniel talked more than anyone, proudly telling the story of how Buck had found him again, as if he were the one narrating a children's book. And then, Daniel said, holding out his fork for emphasis, Buck growled really loud, like loud enough to scare a monster. And then he brought Mom my sock. He was like a furry superhero. Everyone laughed. Even Buck gave a contented huff from his spot under the table. Steve looked at Rachel as the laughter faded. You think it's still watching the house? I know it is, she replied. But it doesn't feel threatening anymore. More like it's waiting. Later, after everyone had gone and Daniel was in bed, Rachel stood on the porch with a mug of tea in hand. Buck lay beside her, the soft rustle of his breathing the only sound in the dark. The wind shifted. Rachel looked toward the trees. Something moved. Not fast, not threatening. Just presence. She didn't flinch. Instead, she said softly, He's a good dog. He's part of us. Whatever you're here for, don't forget that. The woods didn't respond, not out loud, but the wind stilled, as if holding its breath. The next morning, the totem was gone. In its place was a new one, larger, more detailed. It stood nearly a foot high, still made of twigs, moss, and stone. But this one had two figures. One clearly a dog. The other, taller, broader, human-shaped, not menacing, just present. Rachel took Daniel's hand and showed him. What do you think it means? She asked him. He squinted at it, then smiled. That Buck has a friend now. That afternoon, Steve brought over a printed still from the camera. It showed the moment the second totem appeared, captured in a single frame. The camera had triggered during the early hours of the morning. In the photo, a shape stood beside the stones. Tall, faint, but visible. It looked like it was crouching, gently placing the totem down. Rachel traced the shape on the photo with her finger. It's not hiding anymore, not completely. Steve nodded. It knows we're watching. And it doesn't mind. Grant chimed in. Maybe it wants to be seen now. Maybe this is the next phase. Rachel wasn't sure, but she knew the pattern had shifted. That night, Buck stood at the back door again. He whined once. Rachel followed him out. He led her, not to the grove, but toward the creek. It was darker there, the canopy thicker. The water moved gently over stones, and the moonlight filtered down in flickers. Buck stopped suddenly. Rachel stepped beside him. What is it? Then she saw it. On a smooth stone in the center of the creek sat a bundle, wrapped in leaves. Neat, placed deliberately. Rachel stepped carefully into the water. It reached her calves, cold but bearable. She crossed to the stone and picked up the bundle. Inside was a piece of carved wood, soft to the touch, pale as bone. It had markings on it, not letters, not language, more like sound, etched rhythms, patterns like waves. Buck whined gently. Rachel held the object in both hands, suddenly unsure if she should be holding it at all. Back at the house, she showed it to Steve and Grant the next day. Neither man had seen anything like it. "It looks musical," Grant said, "like it's supposed to be held and tapped. Like percussion." They brought it to a sound engineer in town, a retired college professor named Tom Hartley. He examined it for nearly an hour before declaring, "This isn't decorative, it's functional, and it's been made with care. Something knows how to carve acoustics into wood. This isn't primitive, this is intentional." Rachel sat in silence, listening. Buck lay beside the chair, tail still, eyes open. Tom offered to test it further in his home studio. Rachel agreed, but asked for it to be returned after. The following morning, Rachel found something new at the edge of the porch. A single footprint. Not human. Not animal. Large. 3 toes. But the pad was soft, not clawed. And at the heel, there was an indent that almost resembled an arch, as if whatever left it walked upright. Balanced. Buck sniffed it and sat down next to it. Rachel marked the spot with a ring of small pebbles, just so she could remember exactly where it had been. 2 nights later, the object came back. Returned to the same stone in the creek, but this time, slightly different. The etchings had been expanded, more patterns, more lines, and Rachel knew it was a message, not of language, of sound, music. Rachel asked Tom to record Buck's barks, growls, and whines. Then she compared them to the rhythm of the carvings. There was overlap. Not mimicry. Harmony. The creature, whatever it was, had been listening, learning. And now it was composing a kind of duet. Rachel stood in the clearing with the wood in her hands and Buck at her side. She tapped the object once, then again. 2 beats, then a pause. From the woods, a low hum answered. Short, measured. Buck stood, barked once. The hum repeated. Rachel tapped again. Buck barked again, another hum. They were building a rhythm. She whispered, "It's learning to speak through sound." And Buck had been its teacher. That night, the sky remained cloudless. The stars hung low and bright, as if leaning closer to witness something sacred. Rachel watched Buck sleeping by the fire, the carved object beside him. Outside, the woods were alive with music, not loud, not chaotic, just pulsing, echoing, resonating in ways she couldn't explain. It wasn't just watching anymore. It was listening back. The carved instrument sat on the mantel like a puzzle Rachel couldn't stop trying to solve. The more she studied it, the more she noticed subtle patterns etched beneath the visible grooves. A second layer. One you had to feel to understand, like Braille for something not quite human. She didn't play it often. Not because she was afraid, but because she wasn't ready to respond to what it might mean. Buck, however, seemed to understand the object's presence better than anyone. He would often sit beside it, ears slightly angled, as if waiting to hear something she couldn't. That morning, Rachel woke early. The sun had barely started its climb over the trees, and the house was still wrapped in a quiet chill. She wrapped herself in a sweater and made coffee, stepping outside barefoot to let the breeze wake her properly. Buck followed, tail wagging low, his steps steady now. The limp that once marked his stride had lessened over the past few days. Rachel took that as a sign, though of what she wasn't sure. At the edge of the porch, a new item had appeared. Not placed directly on the steps this time, but near the base of the bird bath in the garden. a stone, small and smooth, its surface etched with fine lines, circles layered atop one another, like ripples on a pond. Rachel picked it up carefully, turning it over in her hand. The lines were precise, impossibly uniform for something carved by hand. It was cold to the touch, even in the warming air. She turned to Buck. "Another gift?" Buck sniffed it and wagged his tail. She didn't know what to do with it yet. So she placed it on the kitchen table beside her notes, next to sketches Daniel had made of Buck with his mysterious new friend. One of them showed a giant, shadowy figure sitting beside Buck at the creek, the two of them watching the moon. Another showed the figure placing something in Buck's mouth, like a treat. Rachel wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. Later that day, Steve and Grant returned. They had reviewed the audio from the latest recordings in the grove, and what they found shook them. "It's matching tones," Grant explained, laying out the data. "Call and response. Buck barks, it hums back. But the timing, it's not random. It's musical." Steve added, "It's getting more complex, like it's trying to teach us something." Rachel sat at the table, nodding. "It's not just learning our rhythm, it's composing its own." They played the latest file. Buck's low bark echoed through the speaker, followed by a deep hum, then a higher tone, then silence, then a repeat of the pattern, but inverted. Grant smiled faintly. "It's improvising." Rachel looked to the corner, where Buck lay watching them. "Or it's speaking a language we haven't bothered to learn." The next day, a storm rolled in unexpectedly. Thick clouds moved in fast, darkening the sky by mid-afternoon. Rachel sat with Daniel in the living room, reading to him by lantern light while the wind picked up outside. Buck paced occasionally, then settled near the door as the rain began to fall. It wasn't the thunder or the wind that startled Rachel later that night. It was a knock. 3 slow taps, deliberate, on the front door. Buck growled low in his throat, standing up slowly. Rachel stood too, heart pounding. She crossed the room quietly, her fingers brushing the edge of the table where the carved instrument still lay. She opened the door. There was nothing there. Only a bundle of moss and twigs placed neatly on the porch. Rain fell around it, but the bundle itself was dry, as if it had been placed only seconds before. She bent down and carefully picked it up. Inside the bundle were 3 more stones, each with a different pattern. One had a spiral. One had a star. One had a shape that looked eerily like a tree. She turned to Buck. "Messages?" He didn't bark, just sat, ears alert. Rachel laid the stones out on the table beside the first one. She could feel a rhythm forming in the patterns, not just shapes, but directions. A map of movement, perhaps. A series. She began to sketch the symbols in sequence, noting where each stone had been placed. Something was building. Steve and Grant came the next day. They studied the markings and nodded slowly. "This could be a message about time," Grant said. "Cycles, stars, seasons. Trees suggest life. Spirals suggest change." Rachel said nothing, but she had a feeling it was more than that. It wasn't trying to warn them. It was trying to prepare them. The following morning, Rachel woke to find Buck missing. Panic surged through her as she searched the house, the porch, the yard. She called out into the trees, barefoot and breathless. Then she saw him, standing at the edge of the creek. Not alone, across from him, on the far side of the water, stood the figure. Taller than she remembered. Broader. Still shrouded in shadows, but now clearly visible. It made no move to hide. Rachel didn't shout, didn't run. She walked slowly to the water's edge and stopped beside Buck. The figure raised its arm, not in threat, in greeting. Rachel did the same. It knelt slowly, placed something on the ground, then stood and turned. It walked into the woods without a sound. Rachel crossed the shallow water and approached the spot. There, placed carefully on the moss, was a new carving. This one was unmistakable. A dog, a human, and a third shape. Round, above them, a circle with lines shooting outward, a sun or a star. Rachel turned to Buck. It's telling us we're connected. All of us. Buck wagged his tail, then turned and walked back toward the house. Rachel followed, not looking back. That night, she sat at the kitchen table with all the objects arranged before her. The stones, the carvings, the sound recordings. Each piece told part of a story. And she knew now, they weren't just being watched. They were part of something unfolding. And Buck had opened the door. Rachel woke to bird song. Not the usual early morning chirps from the trees surrounding the property, but something different, slower, more melodic. It came in waves, 3 notes repeating with a pause in between, like a call and response song from deep in the woods. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes, unsure whether it was real or remnants of a dream. Buck stood at the door, ears up, tail motionless. "You hear it too?" she asked. He glanced back at her, then returned his gaze to the trees. She pulled on her boots and flannel jacket, slipped quietly past Daniel's room where he still slept soundly, and opened the door. The air outside was cool, but not cold. The breeze carried the scent of pine and wet soil. Buck trotted ahead of her down the steps and paused near the edge of the yard. That song, it was real. It echoed again, clearer now. 3 notes, pause, then the same again. Rachel followed Buck into the woods. The trees welcomed them with dappled light, and underfoot, the earth was soft and quiet. As they neared the creek, the melody shifted. Not louder, just closer. They arrived at the usual crossing point, but something new waited there. A structure. Made of woven branches and leaves, it resembled a kind of arch. Not tall, only slightly higher than Rachel herself. Inside, the space was empty. It didn't feel ominous. It felt like a doorway. Buck stopped in front of it and sat. Rachel stood beside him, heart pounding, not with fear, but something akin to anticipation. She stepped through the arch. Nothing changed physically, no sudden pull, no flash of light, but something within her shifted. The silence was deeper, the air thicker. Behind her, Buck passed under the arch and settled by her side. Ahead, a new path had been cleared. It hadn't been there the day before. They followed it. It led deeper than she'd ever gone. The trail wound between towering trees and past moss-covered stones that looked older than anything she'd ever seen in these woods. Some had markings on them, simple shapes, stars, waves, eyes, circles, all familiar now. After nearly 20 minutes, the path opened into a clearing unlike any other. At its center stood a monolith, smooth, tall, jet black, and reflective like obsidian, but somehow alive. The surface shimmered like heat rising from pavement. At its base, arranged in a ring, were small objects, more carvings. Each one represented something. Animals, trees, a river, a mountain, and among them, figures shaped like Buck. Buck didn't move toward the monolith. Instead, he sat and looked up at Rachel. She stepped forward, every instinct screaming that this was a moment she wouldn't be able to explain. Not to herself, not to Steve, not to anyone. She touched the surface. Warm. Not like a rock warmed by sun, but like breath. Living warmth. It pulsed once. Then an image formed. Not on the surface, but inside her mind. She saw stars. Dozens. Then hundreds. Galaxies swirling. Then a planet, green and blue and untouched. A presence, not a voice, filled her thoughts, not words, emotions, curiosity, hope, memory, and above all, recognition. A flash of Buck, of Daniel, of her, of their home, of the creek, the totem, the carvings. She stepped back, overwhelmed. Buck pressed his nose into her leg gently, grounding her. She whispered, "You've been showing them who we are." He barked once, soft, assuring. They stood there for a long time, watching the light play across the monolith's surface. Eventually, Rachel took out the small wooden instrument and held it up. The air shifted. The melody from the morning returned. 3 notes. Rachel tapped the pattern into the instrument. Buck barked once. The monolith pulsed again. A line of light traced up its center, then split. From either side, symbols appeared, floating briefly in the air, then dissolving like mist. She didn't need to understand the symbols. She knew the message. Keep going. Rachel and Buck returned through the arch. This time, as they stepped back into the clearing, she turned and saw the structure disassemble itself. Branches loosened, leaves fluttered to the ground, and in moments, nothing remained. Back at the house, Daniel was awake and coloring in the living room. He looked up as they entered. "Where'd you go?" he asked. "Just a walk," Rachel said. "We found something beautiful." Daniel smiled, then returned to his drawing. "I dreamed about the tall one again." He smiled at Buck. He gave him a crown. Rachel's stomach fluttered. "A crown?" Daniel nodded without looking up. A crown made of stars. That evening, Steve and Grant returned, called in by a satellite ping. One of the atmospheric sensors they'd deployed had picked up an unusual energy spike near the area Rachel had visited. "Did you see anything strange?" Steve asked. Rachel debated telling him everything. In the end, she described the arch, the path, the carvings, the monolith, but not the internal vision. Not yet. Grant looked pale. "That kind of energy spike doesn't happen in the forest, not unless someone's setting off experimental tech, or something else entirely." Rachel looked out the window at Buck, who was now sitting at the edge of the yard, staring calmly at the trees. "He's guiding us through this," she said. "We're just catching up." Later that night, Rachel sat with the stones on the table, arranging them in different patterns, trying to understand their full message. Daniel joined her, watching silently. Then he began moving the stones around in a sequence that made no logical sense, but looked right. She let him. Buck sat beside them, eyes on the layout. When Daniel was finished, he said, "That's what they want us to remember." Rachel took a picture of the arrangement. The next morning, all the stones were gone. Only their impressions remained, faint outlines where they'd rested. Buck didn't seem alarmed. He simply walked to the edge of the porch and lay down. Rachel sat beside him, coffee in hand. She looked at the woods. Something was coming. Not a threat. An invitation. And they were ready. The next morning dawned unusually bright, the kind of crisp clarity that only came after a night of heavy dew. Rachel stood at the window, watching the way the sunlight danced on the tops of the trees. It had been nearly a month since Daniel had gone missing, and Buck had brought him back. And the forest that once loomed with mystery now pulsed with quiet meaning. What had once been fear had grown into something else entirely. Something layered, strange, and full of awe. Buck stirred at her feet, lifting his head slowly as if waking from a dream. Rachel knelt beside him and rubbed his ear. "They haven't come back since the monolith," she whispered. "But they're still here. I can feel it." She wasn't alone in that belief anymore. Steve had brought 2 more researchers, people Rachel didn't know, but who wore serious expressions and carried equipment that looked far too advanced for a backwoods investigation. One of them, a man named Collier, had spent 2 days installing sensors across the woods surrounding the property. He said little, but his eyes moved constantly, taking in everything. The second was a woman named Lily, quiet, observant, and unlike the others, willing to talk to Rachel like an equal. They sat together on the porch that afternoon, Lily flipping through notes and sketches. "You said you felt something when you touched the monolith," Lily said. Rachel nodded. "Not like a shock or anything, just images, feelings, a connection." "And you believe Buck facilitated that?" "I don't think I'd be in the loop at all if it weren't for him." Lily looked down at the dog, who was now lying under the porch swing, head resting on his paws. "He's not just smart, he's aware." Rachel didn't disagree. She shared with Lily the stories Daniel had told about his dreams, about the star crown, about the way Buck seemed to move between these encounters like he already knew the script. That evening, something changed again. A low hum returned, fainter than before, but distinctly familiar. Not from the woods. From the sky shuttle stepped outside with Buck and looked up. Above the trees, a single point of light hovered. It didn't blink, didn't move, just hung there, like a lantern caught between stars. Buck didn't bark. He stood very still, ears lifted. Rachel whispered, "You know what that is, don't you?" The light remained for over an hour before dimming slowly, as if sinking into the horizon. The following morning, the humming stopped. Instead, new symbols had been carved into the side of the barn. Not deep, but clearly intentional. Not vandalism. More like a message left gently. 3 lines, a circle, then a spiral. Lily photographed it, sent it to the team. Grant and Steve arrived within the hour. Steve touched the markings lightly. "Same pattern from the grove. And the stones," Rachel added. That night, Daniel had another dream. He described it at breakfast with sleepy certainty. "He told me something," he said, voice muffled by a spoonful of cereal. "The tall one. He said Buck's gonna lead the way again." Rachel's hand paused mid-stir in her tea. Daniel continued, "He said the trees will move, and there will be a light, and that Buck will know which way to go." Rachel turned to Buck. He was sitting at the sliding door, staring into the woods like always. That afternoon, Rachel packed a small bag, water, snacks, a notepad, and the carved wooden instrument. She didn't know why, only that something in her bones told her it was time. She waited until Daniel was asleep, then opened the back door. Buck stood and moved ahead without needing to be called. They passed through the usual paths, but tonight the air was different, heavy, pregnant with something unspoken. Near the creek, the air shimmered, like heat. Buck stepped through without hesitation. Rachel followed, heart racing. On the other side, the forest looked different. Not wrong, just altered. The trees leaned in directions they hadn't before. The ground was drier. The stars overhead seemed brighter. Buck took a new path, one Rachel hadn't seen in all their weeks of walking. The terrain shifted subtly with every step, sometimes smooth, sometimes dense, as if the land itself couldn't decide what it was supposed to be. They walked for what felt like hours, but when Rachel checked her watch, only 20 minutes had passed. Finally, they reached a clearing she had never seen before. And there, in the center, stood another monolith. This one was shorter, white, translucent, glowing softly from within. Buck didn't wait. He walked to it and sat. Rachel approached more slowly, feeling the hum return. Not through her ears, but through her bones. She touched the surface. The world fell away. She wasn't unconscious. She was aware of her body, of the ground beneath her, of Buck sitting nearby. But her mind was flooded with images, not memories, histories. She saw other beings, not just the tall ones, but creatures made of light, of shadow, of water, of flame. She saw planets spinning. She saw music as color. She saw Buck, standing in a different forest, surrounded by creatures who watched him with reverence. Then a message, not in words, but in feeling. You are not alone. The light dimmed. Rachel stepped back, trembling. Buck stood and brushed against her leg gently. She whispered, "You've been a part of something bigger this whole time." The path behind them was gone. In its place, a bridge of stones led through a different section of forest. They followed. It led to another arch, smaller, more delicate. Buck passed through first. Rachel hesitated, then followed. And just like that, they were back. At the edge of their property, near the barn. She looked back. No arch, no bridge, only the usual trees. But the barn door had a new carving. This one unmistakable. Buck, standing tall, a light over his head. Rachel pressed her palm to the wood and whispered, "We're listening." The days that followed were quiet in a way that felt sacred. Rachel spent more time outside, her hands in the soil, her eyes on the trees, watching, always watching, but never with fear. Buck lay in the grass, facing the woods as if holding silent communion. Daniel played freely in the yard again, laughter returning to his voice like the echo of something remembered. Each night, the stars seemed to burn a little brighter. Rachel noticed it, not just in the sky, but in the way Buck moved, in the way the trees bent slightly when he passed, as if greeting him. The researchers remained, but their role had changed. Collier packed up his sensors after a week of no new readings, claiming he had all he needed. Lily, however, stayed. She no longer brought equipment. Instead, she brought notebooks, stories, questions. She sat with Rachel most evenings, sipping tea as they talked. Not as scientist and subject, but as friends. "There's a theory I've been working on," Lily said one night, her voice low, like she didn't want to disturb the peace. "That beings like this don't come to us because of our machines or signals. They come because of resonance, harmony, vibration of the spirit." Rachel didn't answer right away. Buck, lying at her feet, gave a quiet huff. "They came for him?" Rachel said softly. "Or maybe he called them. Either way, they trusted him first." That night, Rachel had her first dream. Not Daniel's dream. Not a memory. A vision. She stood in the same clearing as before, but this time the monoliths surrounded her. Dozens of them. Tall and glowing, each humming a different note. Buck was there, and he was not alone. Figures gathered. Tall, luminous, their outlines barely defined. They didn't speak. They watched. And then they bowed. To Buck. Rachel awoke with tears on her cheeks. She found him already awake, sitting at the window, gazing out into the dark. She joined him, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside him. "You're something more," she whispered. "I don't know what exactly, but I know now why they chose you." The next morning, Rachel found something at the edge of the property. A ring of stones, newly formed, perfect in its circle. In the center, a small wooden carving. It was unmistakable. Buck, standing tall, light radiating from him, his tail in mid-wag. Beneath the carving, carved into the earth, were two symbols. One she recognized from the stones, a spiral. And another, new to her. Two arcs enclosing a star. Lily studied the markings for hours, but even she seemed at a loss. "It's a message, final, I think, like a seal, a gift." Buck didn't approach the ring. He stood a few feet away, tail still, posture calm. Daniel came outside later that day and ran to the circle. He knelt down, touched the carving, then turned to Rachel with a smile that made her breath catch. "He said goodbye," Daniel said. Rachel blinked. "Who did?" "The tall one, in my dream. He said it's time." That night, the forest changed again. Not visibly, not audibly, but it felt lighter, as if something had been lifted, released. The heaviness that had hung over the trees for weeks melted away. No new carvings appeared. No more monoliths. No more symbols or objects. Just the forest, as it had always been. And Buck, who had begun to slow. Rachel noticed it gradually. He didn't wake as early. His steps grew more measured. He spent longer stretches sleeping in the sun. The vet found nothing wrong. "He's aging," Dr. Carter said gently. "That's all. He's had a long life, a good one." Rachel nodded, but she knew. He had given something, offered a part of himself to something larger, something vast. And now that it was done, his body was finally ready to rest. One morning, Rachel found him at the edge of the grove. He wasn't moving, but he wasn't afraid. Just resting, his eyes open, looking into the trees. She sat beside him, brushing her fingers through his fur. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." He lifted his head once, just enough to rest it against her hand. Then he closed his eyes. When he was gone, the world stayed still for a long time. Rachel buried him beneath the old cedar, the place where they'd found Daniel, the place where everything had started. She carved a marker herself, a wooden slab with a single spiral and a star. Daniel helped plant flowers. Lily brought stones from the grove and arranged them in a ring. The forest remained quiet. Weeks passed, then months. Life resumed. Daniel started school again. Rachel returned to teaching part-time at the little schoolhouse in town. People stopped by to ask how she was doing, how Daniel was. Some had heard the stories. Most believed them in pieces. But no one doubted Buck's heroism. A year passed. On the anniversary of his passing, Rachel walked alone to the cedar tree. She sat beside the grave, hand resting on the marker. "I still feel you," she whispered. "Still hear you in the leaves." The wind stirred gently, and from somewhere far off in the forest, a sound echoed. 3 notes. A pause. 3 notes again. Rachel closed her eyes. "I know," she said. "We're still listening."